It is a great pleasure to welcome to this conversation Simon Kold, author of the new book, On the Hunt for Great Companies, an investor's guide to evaluating business quality and durability. Just by way of background, Simon is the founder of Kold Investments, a Copenhagen-based investment firm. He was previously at Novo Holdings, one of the world's largest investment organizations with assets of about 150 billion euros. He is one of the few fund managers who also has a degree in theology and had a stint in stand-up comedy. And Simon, I have to say, the book is very entertaining while being incredibly enlightening as well. So you managed to really pull off something special here.
Thank you, John.
Well, would love to get into it a little bit. Tell us, what makes this book different? You do allude to it in your intro. There's obviously a lot of books that have been written on looking for great businesses, but you have found quite a special angle here.
Yeah, so I think there are two things that makes it different. One is you mentioned the stylistic aspect, which we can get back to, but I think the original idea for the book was to make a toolbox book. Like I would think actually like, I don't know, how would you describe your own book as a toolbox book?
As a toolbox book, to some degree, I did try to make it pretty practical. But maybe not to the extent that you did in those little, call outs where you have some really, really applicable tips for investors.
Sure, but readers can probably imagine like a spectrum of books where you have, on the one hand, people who present one like really original one idea, and then they argue for that idea throughout the book. And then on the other side of the spectrum, you have something which is maybe a little bit more a synthesis of a lot of different stuff, but then very practical. So I would say my book is like the original idea for the book was to make sort of like a textbook on evaluating business quality, and then have it be like, I would describe it as a toolbox, like very, very practical, like specific steps you take. And that's, and that is maybe what made the original idea a little bit unique. But then the paradox kind of happened that was a very dry, like almost the driest kind of investment book you can imagine. But then I was pushed a little bit by one of my early reviewers who said it was so dry, it was so boring, he couldn't see my personality in it. So I got pushed over this sort of mental journey it was to start adding humor to it, which is why it now ended up being this little bit weird combination of humor with this dry, semi-advanced toolbox book.
Well, it does increase the likelihood that people will actually read it and internalize the quite important lessons and tips you have in there for actually going about finding great companies. And I love the analogy of you call it sniffer dogs, I believe, and you compare it to kind of dowsers and senior dowsers. Tell us a little bit about that. I think that's so on point and really fascinating.
So I like to make these high contrast, exaggerated analogies. I mean, the world is not that black and white, right? But I think it makes the point come across that you have, on the one hand side, you have people who they think like a scientist. The reason I chose sniffer dogs is like they gather real world evidence, and then they follow that in pursuit of the truth to make an informed decision. And then on the opposite side of that spectrum, you have these dowsers, they walk around with the stick, and the stick, they think that they are really diligent in the way they walk around with the stick, but really the stick is just reacting to stimuli that are within them, not outside them. They're not really observing the world. They're just looking for some kind of pseudo evidence that confirms their pre-existing beliefs. And I think in the world of, especially in the, you could say, the commercial side of the investment industry, there's a lot of, looking for a good argument for what you're already doing is the right thing. And a lot of communication around that. And I think you can fool yourself. I think we're probably all victims of that, of fooling ourselves, looking for evidence that are pretty much just validating our pre-existing beliefs. And I think I am certainly also guilty of that, right? So the idea is that following these analytical recipes for each of these aspects and subcomponents of these quality characteristics can help you make a more informed decision about quality. And obviously, the quality of a business is an input to determining its value. I mean, a lot of people have asked me if my book is about quality investing. I would disagree with that. I know maybe the title hints a little bit too much at that. It's a book about evaluating quality. I'm not postulating that a certain type of characteristic necessarily leads to better investment outcomes. It's more like a book on evaluating quality.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to kind of touch on this a little bit more, this idea of dowsers and senior dowsers, I think it's so important to actually put that in writing and point that out, because I do think a lot of folks feel that there's truth in that, but there are some kind of very famous investors who are almost regarded like gurus, and they may say something from just personal experience or some anecdotes, and it gets just picked up as the gospel truth, when oftentimes there's not a lot of sniffing behind it. So I think just putting that in writing is refreshing.
Yeah, I would say though the sniffer doubt, the senior doubt is like, it's an old comedy trick, right? If you wanna pick on somebody, you better pick on somebody who is in a position of strength. So that's why it's a little bit better to mock somebody who is then senior. I don't think I have any kind of specific individuals in mind or anything. It's just more like but I think you're right. You mentioned this argument from authority there. I have in the appendix of my book. It's probably the most original part of the book. I have this sort of. It's not a checklist in terms of like you need to check these aspects of the company. It's a specific checklist you can use to test your own sort of logic behind the logical forms, the inductive logical forms. And one of them is argument by authority, as you mentioned there, that sometimes you see people arguing the world must be in a certain way, or this must be true because X says it's true, right? And there's these pitfalls you can use to check your own reasoning for. That's yeah,
that's very helpful. And I think there's this tension between there is value in experience in the investment business, and so people who've seen situations and have been around the block, there is something to it, but it doesn't mean you can just stop, doing the inquisitive analysis that I think people do early in their careers. That's what they rely on.
Yeah, I would say, I mean, you could validly make a critical point about my book. You could say like, well, aren't there some investors who can rely only on sort of high-level pattern recognition? Which I would say, in my work, I would say, okay, I rely on pattern recognition to build a hypothesis, and then I rely on my analysis to test that hypothesis. Well, aren't there then people who are just so good at building the right theories in the first place that they can kind of a priori determine this? They're so good at determining pattern recognition. So everything I write in my book is like, they don't need that. Actually think that's a valid criticism. That yes, there are maybe a few like super geniuses like that, but I just think for like maybe like Warren Buffett or something, right? But I just think for like 99.9 of all professional investors, I just don't believe that's the case, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think you're losing a lot of readers to those kinds of people that don't need any of this. So I guess you have some really interesting and nice, I'd say, fun to look at illustrations in the book that I believe you actually commissioned just for this book. And one of those is when you talk about switching costs. I thought that was such a great illustration because switching costs are often put out there as this great thing, and it can be for a while, but ultimately may not be the best kind of source of moat, if you will.
Yeah, it's like a drawing, like almost like a 2D video game where you have a kind of two graves, and the depth of the grave is sort of indicating of the intensity of the switching cost, right? And then you have these two guys who represent two sort of software companies trying to drag people in the middle, and then once they have them, they are in this grave, and then it's hard to get up. And then just the point I make is the people who are already in the grave, they have switching costs, so there's a competitive advantage, but there's really not a big competitive advantage with regard to the people who are not captured yet. And so I think switching cost is super important. Like, for instance, I focus personally a lot on network effect companies, right? And network effects, there's some certain types of erosions of network effects. So specifically for network effects, I like to see that combined with, for example, switching costs. Or you could say a company like Apple, I think I mentioned. So a company that has a demand side advantage, like brand or network effect, it's good if it's combined with switching costs. But if you just have switching costs only, you have no way to really sustainably get customers, have an advantage in getting customers, and have an advantage is in adding value to those customers, superior value. So there you have a much higher risk of being like this super high value extractive company. I recently read the book Winning on Purpose. I think he articulated that. Unfortunately, I didn't reference that in my book because I read it afterwards. But he articulated it's very good that he says, I wish I could remember the exact formulation, but like when you think about it, profit is really just a function of value creation and then the amount of value extraction of that value creation. People think very often so heuristically about these metrics accounting metrics, profit. Like, profit is just the extraction part of the value created, but you can extract too much value. That's not a sustainable. I have a chapter on that, but I actually think that that book is captured is also very nice. So that's a good book I could also recommend. I have a specific chapter on value extraction. I just wish I had read and referenced that Winning on Purpose book also prior to writing the book.
Yeah, and you have a chart in the book, I believe, on value extraction that makes it very easy to understand. What's maybe not so easy to know as an investor is to what extent a company is, extracting too much or too little. Because that means you need to somehow also estimate the actual value added. Do you have any thoughts around that?
Yeah, so my own personal experience from the real world, you can say, is like it's pretty useful, I think, to speak to customers and to speak to also former customers and former employees and so on, because value extraction is not only on the customer side, it's also on the supplier side and the employee side. And I also don't like to see, I hear a lot of times, I think this is kind of paradox. So companies that have a long history of raising prices, you sometimes hear them from the investment community being like applauded. Oh, they're so good at raising prices. They have so much pricing power. I'm not necessarily I'm not sure I totally buy into that just because you have exercised your pricing power means you have pricing power. Well, it means that you had it, and it certainly shows that you had the ability to do it, but maybe you have now used it. Like, I don't think it's necessary. I don't think it's that easy to say, well, look, there's a lot of untapped value here. I don't think it. I don't think there's like a super easy to follow recipe to determine this with certainty. But I think you can do some sniffing around, to figure out if it's certainly too value extractive. There's also metrics like retention rates and so on, right? That also helps you maybe a little bit. But I think generally speaking, to people who have left can be helpful. Of course, you just don't need to do it only, like, back to the point about anecdotal evidence. You don't need to maybe just do it once to check it. You maybe have to do a little bit, get a little bit better sort of statistical representation by actually speaking to a few more than just, like your cousin or whoever were the random person that you spoke to, so confirming your thesis that they weren't value extractive.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, speaking to customers, because I've sometimes been a customer myself, and you sort of have a gut feel for whether, you're being taken advantage of, or whether a company is, kind of being really friendly in how they price relative to the value they provide. So I think that's a great point. Let's talk a little bit about, just to continue on this, since we mentioned switching costs and network effects. Any other kind of sources or manifestations of competitive advantage that you would highlight?
So I think that especially the topic of competitive advantages is already so well described in the literature. I think maybe to the extent that people are maybe, I don't know, like maybe even thinking too much about it, like I feel like it's everywhere every time you hear about it. And I think one thing that I think is interesting discussion in my book is the idea of thinking about competitive disadvantages. So just inverting it. And just when you look at a company, rather than trying to only see what is the competitive advantages that my company has over its competitors and how can I test them, try to think about, okay, what are then the disadvantages that, so what are the advantages that each of the direct and indirect competitors may have over my company, and then try to focus my analytical firepower to testing those and measuring those. I have this analogy with two boxes, and I kind of satirize it a little bit, so over dramatize it. Like, it's kind of like you had these two boxes. One has a reach advantage over the other. So you go out and you do your due diligence and you measure that with your measurement tape, and sure enough, he has a longer reach. So you conclude, due diligence done, check, competitive advantage verified. But then the opponent, he has a higher ring IQ and he's faster, and you didn't even spend time analyzing that. So that's kind of my satirization of it. When you listen to all these investment podcasts, especially these kind of stock pitching investment podcast, you always hear about these competitive advantages. You never hear about competitive disadvantages. And that's something that doesn't make sense statistically, right? There must be a lot of companies with competitive disadvantages. If every time I hear about some company on a podcast, it has all these wonderful advantages.
Yeah, it's that's a great point, actually. Simply mathematically, it's not possible for everyone to have a competitive advantage. Referenced to whom?
Yeah, maybe it has an advantage, but then just the some of the competitors have different kinds of advantages over you, right?
Right. Yeah. So, which advantage is actually most relevant?
Well, I don't think there's one that's more relevant. I have, in my own personal investment style, I focus particularly on scale effects on the demand and supply side, so network effects and scale economies. But I don't. It's not because I think that those are necessarily better. It's just because I think I have a more refined process around that, and I have more experience in that. So it's more like a decision to focus on something I think I know a little bit more about. But I don't think that those are necessarily better. Like, for instance, network effects, maybe they have a tendency to lead to more monopolistic-ish market positions, but they definitely also have the tendency to have potential for dramatic collapse, which you maybe don't see in the case of other forms of advantage. Because they can reverse and they come with often with operating leverage and so on. So I don't really think there's one that's better or the other. But I think within these forms, there are a lot of characteristics that determine an advantage which is intense and durable. And sometimes you see something which is intense but not durable, or you see something which is durable but not very intense, and I think what I try to do is not describe something totally new in terms of types of competitive advantage. Most of this is already described. In fact, I would say most of the determinants are also pretty well described in academia and stuff like that. I just think I try to provide a synthesis of this for the practical investor that can be used day to day.
Yeah. And talk a little bit about kind of reinvestment options and returns on incremental capital, because I feel like that's also often overlooked.
Yeah, so obviously, if you have a company that that cannot reinvest its capital into high return capital opportunities, let's assume you have two companies. They both have rational capital allocation. They allocate capital in the way that maximizes value, but one just has better options for organic reinvestment than the other one. Then, if you calculate it, this company will be worth much more. Like the companies that will generate stellar returns, they will have typically ways to reinvest capital in a way that's very accretive. Now, I think it's not only about having reinvestment options which are in themselves financially lucrative. I think it's very good if it's something that strengthens what you already had. So if you're talking about somebody who's maybe expanding geographically, that each of those new stores or whatever it is that they are investing in, of factories or whatever, if they in themselves have a lucrative financial return, but their mere existence strengthens the relative strength of what you already had. That's I think Buffett, he called it moat widening opportunities, right? I like companies that have that, but of course you can also have great companies who maybe necessarily not have great reinvestment options, and then they just have to, I don't know, pay dividends or do share buybacks or use the capital in some form of rational way, not use it on low return reinvestment options. In terms of incremental return on capital, I think that if there's one group of investors who maybe get satirized or bashed a little bit in my book, I would say it's the very heuristic. It's the very people who are very much into like ratios, price earnings, return on invested capital, who can sort of, they perceive the universe is very complex. It's like you cannot just fold the entire universe into like two ratios and then this is it. I think you're missing something by doing that. It's of course reasonable to look at these metrics. It's not that I'm making the case that you shouldn't look at them, but I think you can maybe do a little bit better, that than only looking at blind staring at these heuristic numbers. And I have this illustration where I satirize this kind of totalitarian right dogmatic thinker who looks at this chart with return on invested capital, but then he stares so much at it that he can't see that the company in fact has a incredibly high incremental return on invested capital. So it's the kind of company that is maybe it's just about the sort of break-even stage. It's an emerging quality company, and this totalitarian ROIC fanatic is totally missing the point by only looking at this heuristic.
Right, absolutely. So also changes in returns on capital over time, as companies mature or get to a scale. I think that's important to consider.
I think you had a great episode on that in your podcast, the one with it was something with emerging quality. I think that I really liked it. I think I listened to it 3 or 4 times or something. I would highly recommend listeners to go back and listen to that on that topic. I think it's really a great episode, John.
Oh, thank you. Probably was one of my partners, Phil or Elliot, that made the good points. But I guess the other thing I would just mention is also this idea of companies that have high returns on capital, but employ very little capital in their business, and then how relevant is it to look at returns on capital? Because of course they're going to be very high, but the business doesn't really need capital.
Yeah, I deal with that in a different chapter. So I didn't think of it so much as reinvestment options, but more sort of this. I thought about it as sort of some like you have some kind of metabolism, right? You can grow. The way I think about it, my analogy, I'm not even sure if I mentioned that in the book, but I think about it like what is the cost to grow something? Like, do you have like an efficient or inefficient metabolism? And you just have some companies, like I think the example I mentioned with Visa from the IPO till today, where it was just like incredible profitable growth, right? Like you have some of these companies that have this rare ability to grow in a very, very profitable way with very high incremental return on capital that doesn't really, doesn't even need to deploy a lot of capital. That's of course very, very very nice when it works. But this kind of crazy operating leverage, you could say, it can of course also work against you. So most companies with operating leverage, they have what I call asymmetrical operating leverage, like so airlines or something, right? You have operating leverage, but only up to the point where you have like 100% utilized capacity, and then you have like fitness clubs or something, and then so you kind of have operating leverage against you, and then you have these rare companies like Google or Visa or something, which has like almost infinite positive operating leverage, at least if you look at them with hindsight, right? But I still think like operating leverage, yes, it can magnify returns upwards, but also downwards. So you have to think about it in both ways.
Absolutely. You also have an interesting chapter on long-term incentives, where you make some great points about management teams and how they're compensated. Tell us just a little bit about that.
I think that's actually. I suspect a lot of your listeners will that will not be the chapter where they disagree with me. I think that's already pretty well described. I just think it would be weird if I didn't have a chapter on that. I think it's like super important. I'm generally. I just think especially when I read proxy statements and so on, I'm very often surprised by the amount of incentives that I think creates a disincentive to create long-term shareholder value, that creates an incentive to think too short-term, to think in a 2 to 3 year horizon, or create an incentive to boost the share price. I generally like when there's something that vests over a very long period. I don't think that chapter is. I don't know. Did you feel that was? I think that's probably one of the least original chapters, but like super important. I don't know how you felt. Or
well, definitely super important. But I also feel like that there's a lot of folks that will take equity-like compensation and basically view it as synonymous with an insider owning a lot of stock or having a lot of net worth, actually owning shares, where the upside and downside is sort of proportional to what the shareholders get. So I think you made some good points in there around just sort of the typical pay package and how it's maybe not actually as well aligned as people tend to think.
Yeah, sure. I try to, but I think it's difficult to find the perfect, because there's always issues with. You can always find issues with different things. I prefer when they have like when I definitely like that the actual shareholding relative to the base salaries is reasonably high, but I don't like these like super big short-term bonuses, or like the criteria that make people do something for the sake of achieving that 2 to 3 year goal. I think I personally think that investors focus a lot on financial incentives, and that's probably a good idea. But I think a lot of those folks, they don't focus enough on the sort of evaluating the same people's sort of internal motivations. I talk about that in the prior chapter to the incentive chapter. That's my chapter 1. I generally focus a lot on that. And I have all these suggestions on how to look at that. I like to see a combination of internal motivation and financial motivation that are both really long term.
So maybe just a high level view, how do you gauge internal motivation?
So, well, I think for starters, if you have been at the company for a really long time and the people below you, and maybe in general, if you can even get like overall employee retention rates, that's one proxy. Product enthusiasm, perseverance through setback, authenticity in communication. I think there are many like small indicators, and if you see, it's not like there's a perfect cause relation, but if you just see multiple of them, they tend to kind of correlate with sort of love for the company, love for the customers, love for the employees, and so on. And they would, I don't know, sometimes you just have a feeling by having studied, like I like to study all historical communication of a company. I like listen to all old earnings calls and so on. When I can do that because I'm a concentrated investor, right? But sometimes I just come to the point where I have no doubt that this individual doesn't need to be the founder, but it is sometimes the founder, sometimes it's a person who has just been with the company, that person's entire career, or that they really almost would do it without money. You just, they're so driven by what they're doing that you as a human being, you learn, not by being an investor, just by being alive, you learn to interpret these signals. You can see when somebody is like really, really passionate about what they're doing.
Yeah, I think that's true. You have a basically an entire section devoted to kind of why some companies are less risky and more valuable than others, and the degree of value extraction is one of those. And then you have staying power. I'm wondering, how would you sum up kind of the key points there?
For staying power, or for the whole third part?
For the whole part, but let's start with staying power.
Yeah, because the thing for the whole part is difficult.
I know it's a lot.
I had a lot of problems figuring out a title for part 3, right? Because it couldn't just be called like the rest or other.
Yeah.
So I don't think my editor would have liked that. So, but staying power, I think, is it's something that I think for some reason. So I had 46 reviewers of my book, and a lot of them really experienced investors. But what I noted was quite interesting, that a lot of people pointed out that particular chapter as something that was particularly of interest to them, or something where they felt like they had a blind spot. And I was actually quite surprised with that. I think you have some investors who are really, really focused on. So if you're like a really, really defensive, ultra quality investor, maybe you focus more on this than other people. Maybe if you're like more like me, maybe you're a little bit less inclined to focus on, I don't know, but the idea is just to try to decompose, in addition to competitive advantage, what are the determinants of sort of, you could say, likelihood that your company will be relevant or in far into the future. And I talk about looking at the adoption curve of the particular technology. Is it an elongated adoption curve, like elevators or swimming pools? Well, probably all else equal, that contributes to higher staying power, or is it some kind of super compressed adoption curve like AI? Like so. There's much more changes going on in market shares and technologies. You have you can look at how culturally rooted it is. You can look at how cost effective it is. I think that's just like, think about like railroads. Like, there have been many other forms of transportation invented since then, and they have different kind of benefits, but just by the sheer cost effectiveness of rail transport, it's still relevant. Yeah, there are these determinants, and I think it's an easy mental model to apply to different companies. And for some reason, I don't think it's very advanced. But for some reason, some people felt that was novel. So maybe it's good. Maybe it's a good chapter. Maybe because some people, maybe if you're a little bit more growth investor, maybe you have a blind spot there. So for some reason, people liked it. So yeah.
Yeah, and just on that point, whether it's elongated or compressed, I feel like that really is a blind spot for a lot of investors. I mean, you take AI right now, and some of the valuations, they don't really take into account that the leadership in those various segments could change. Nobody really knows what the AI, value map will look like 5 or 10 years from now, and yet people are willing to pay a lot for the current leaders. So,
yeah, I think what is nice is, of course, when you have a foreseeable, when you can kind of see that, when you think you are in a position where you can see how that adoption curve will evolve over the next decade, and you're almost sure that it's already at the point where market shares is kind of relatively stable, and there probably won't be huge shifts in technology, and you just have like total clarity in your mind about how the destination 10 years out will be like. But of course, it can be, if it's too predictable, it's probably also priced in. So without sounding like I pitch a stock or something, I think like just one company that comes to mind as an example could be something like Dolby Labs, where they have, they are in adoption of certain forms of sound technology that I personally believe that will, like, maybe you're at the point of adoption of some of these technologies where it's pretty unreasonable that this adoption curve will not continue, and that they are already so entrenched that's just one company where I think like maybe that's it's still early, so it's still like not decided, like in this, if compared to elevators or something, where it's like, okay, market share is probably not going to change a lot there, right? That's already so obvious, but I think like maybe that's an example where it's a little bit more compressed. It's maybe like a 20-year adoption curve, and maybe you're halfway in. So it's not like a 70-year adoption curve. But at least it's not like some kind of, like I use this exaggerated example with MIDI ringtones as sort of this silly example of something which happened like a blitz in very, very short time, and then it was over.
Yeah, I remember those. Yeah, or maybe another example, if you go 10 years back, I think it was pretty clear that Google was going to be the leader, basically the only search engine over the next 10 years. And yet you could probably buy the company at not too rich a valuation. Maybe today Google is a little bit less clear, over the next 10 years, given things like ChatGPT. But something like, take ChatGPT. It's not super clear how that's going to look 10 years from now, at least to me.
Yeah, for sure. I think you need to take some. Because I take staying power risk. I like to think about it this way when I invest, because I'm not I don't view myself as like a defensive quality investor in the sense I view myself as a little bit more sort of emerging quality. Back to your good episode, so I like that I don't have like full clarity on that. I would prefer to have full clarity, but I can accept a certain amount of risk there if I think that I'm getting rewarded. But I'm not really into the sort of super hyper growth kind of very rapid adoption curves where I agree with you, like on AI or something. It would, to me at least, be very hard to predict. You would need to have so much domain expertise in that particular product to have an edge, and I don't have that. So I'm at a disadvantage for sure to other investors there.
And let me ask you, I'm not sure, I don't think you covered this in the book, but just looking as an investor, looking globally and being on the hunt for great companies, do you have any thoughts on different geographies? Just where, in your experience, what have been some good hunting grounds, either in terms of geography or sectors? Where do you feel like it are the best places to look?
I honestly don't know which sectors or geographies. I like to not be too dogmatic about stuff. I think the whole way that a lot of investment managers have sort of set up shop to focus on. So I focus on this sector, I focus on this region, and then people who allocate to them, then they can allocate to them based on these buckets and so on. I mean, I don't know, not to point fingers at anybody, but that's certainly not how I set up my own company, because I just like to focus on something that I think makes sense from an investment perspective and then take it from there. And I think that, of course, if investing in a company in a particular sector or in a particular region requires sector-specific domain expertise or country-specific domain expertise, then it means that it's uninvestable for me. But I think there's a lot of opportunities for someone that you could maybe call a generalist to find companies that they're able to understand and invest in across sectors and regions. But I think when it comes to, like, in recent years, there's been a lot of debate, for example, over, can you invest in China? Like, well, when something gets so much out of favor, maybe that's the time when it actually becomes interesting to start looking at a place like that, And then the question is just how much of your portfolio are you willing to risk? Then you probably shouldn't. It probably shouldn't be the whole thing, right? But I think like that's the reason you have a portfolio. You have a portfolio so that you can take calculated risks. So I don't have a particular rule on that. I just like to try to avoid stuff I don't think I can understand. So for instance, like, my book doesn't help you figure out which product is gonna win. What's the best product? Like, and if it's really critical, if you're like a venture investor or something, if that's really critical, I mean, then you need to be. I believe you need to be have a totally different skill set than what is described in this book, and then you should probably try to, avoid those situations.
That's a good point. I guess we've covered a lot. Is there anything that we haven't talked about that you'd like to highlight or share?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I definitely want to make the point, if people, I don't know, now maybe people, if when they hear about the book, they maybe have the impression that because there's this humor in it that I did it just to kind of make a comedy investing book or something. That's actually totally not the case. It started out, I actually had a totally dry, like almost like academically dry book that I started adding to. So it just that happened by accident. So I definitely just want to kill that misconception that might arise. It's not a book about quality investing. It's a book about evaluating quality. It's not a book for stock market investing only. I view it equally as a book for private market investors. I mean, personally have a mix of public and private market investment experience, and I think that this book should certainly also be for private market investors. But other than that, yeah, I just wish I had made like a list of other books to recommend in the book. Like maybe I'll do that if there will ever be a second edition, like for further reading or something.
Yeah, well, we'll see if you come back with another edition in the future. But certainly for now, I can highly recommend the book. I think it's very insightful. There's a lot of practical tips on how to actually go about finding great businesses, and well worth the read. So thank you, Simon, for coming on and talking about the book. We truly appreciate it.
Thank you, John. Thank you so much for having me, and big fan of your podcast.
Thank you. Best wishes, and goodbye for now.